Across the board, women continue to earn less than men. White women make about 80 cents to a man's dollar. Black women earn 66 cents. Native women and Latinas, just 58 cents. And Asian American women, though often reported higher earnings, still face wide pay gaps depending on ethnicity and industry. The numbers tell a story about the urgent need for change. I'm Julene Allen, and this is Conversations for Equal Pay, where we talk with leaders, innovators, and change makers about closing the gap and uplifting women of color in the workplace. You're listening to Conversations for Equal Pay. We're talking to Christina Baal-Owens today, the Interim Executive Director of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, or NAPAWF. Christina is a dynamic leader and advocate dedicated to uplifting the voices of Asian Americans and Pacific Islander women and girls, championing gender and racial justice, and advancing policies that promote equity, economic empowerment, and reproductive freedom. Christina, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Christina, the NAPAWF highlights that the wage gap for Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander women is often masked by the model minority myth, with some groups earning as little as 48 to 54 cents for every dollar paid to white, non-Hispanic men. What single policy change will have the biggest, most direct impact on closing the worst pay gaps for AA-NHPI women?
NAPAWF has been at the forefront of doing this work, looking at wage disparities between AA-NHPI women and girls and gender expansive folks compared to white non-Hispanic men. And so I want to go back for a minute and sort of look at the phrase model minority and how it came to be, how our community has been described. So that term comes from a white sociologist in 1966. It was first used in a New York Times article to describe Japanese Americans. And really, that term, beyond sort of framing API folks as people who are highly educated, wealthy, not needing support from systems and governments, besides masking some of the issues we have, the real main goal of that phrase and that phrase being used in that article was to pit people of color against each other, right? So to take away the idea that there are systemic issues that are faced by people of color, including API folks, but really pitting us against Black and Latino communities, saying that, look, they were able to do it, right? They pulled themselves up by their bootstraps. Why can't all of you? And so that phrase in itself is not just harmful to our community, it's harmful to all people of color in the workplace. And it erases the fact that there are systemic issues that are creating these wage gaps, are creating and holding people back from opportunity, and create that there are systemic issues that are holding people of color back in the workplace from ascending and economic justice and economic stability. So that phrase as it applies to the API community is not true. I mean, one, the API community is not a monolith. It is very diverse. There are communities that if you look specifically at one community, their education levels read as high, their wages read as high. If you look at South Asian folks, for example, it is a lower mean wage, right? So like if you look at the wage disparities even within our community, there is information there that will tell you more about our community. Unfortunately, I don't think there's one policy. I wish there was. There was sort of this magic policy that would change that. I think there's a few things that we would love to see and that we have looked at how we can close the gap between API women and girls and white non-Hispanic men as far as wages. One being raising the federal minimum wage. I mean, if the floor is higher for everyone, then that gap can be smaller. People may or may not know that the federal minimum wage is still $7.25 an hour. It is set by state, so many states have a higher minimum wage, but the federal floor is $7.25, which we know is not a living wage, and we know sets people up to be full-time workers living in poverty, not able to afford their basic needs. It also allows for people to have a range of salaries that they're being paid for the same job, right? So someone who people decide has a better background, has had more opportunities, can make more than 725 for the same job, but it is legal in some states to pay someone 725 for the same job. The other thing that we need to look at is pay transparency. Making, if people knew more about what people were being paid and seeing the disparities, I think there'd be a lot more outrage about what the disparities are between API women, between Black women, between Latino women and white men, or women in general and men. Some industries, you have to show salary, like government, for example, that is all public. People can look that up. Nonprofits, the top five earners, those salaries are public. But in many industries, there's no transparency around what people are being paid. So I could try to look at a corporation and see if men and women are being paid on a similar scale, there's equity in that scale. I can look at, try to find demographics based on race or age, and that is not available. So there were federal policies saying that it was required to make those, make salaries transparent and available. There'd also be, I think people would be more active in trying to change this issue and to advocate on this issue. And then another piece of this is when we look at the data on wage equity, we really only take into consideration salaries. And we know as women of color, as people existing in this world, there's a lot of things that also factor into economic prosperity, economic stability, things like healthcare costs, things like childcare costs, things like cost of living in the area. And so part of what NAPAWF is trying to do is to create data that reflects those issues. API women are have a lot of responsibility as far as caretaking for both elders and children, and that comes at a cost. And how does that cost affect what their actual wage or what their actual economic status means? How does immigration status affect that? How does educational costs? How does healthcare costs? How do all of those things, our access or lack of access to that, how does that affect our economic status? So I feel like a combination of those things is really what we would need to see a close in that wage gap. And that's why NAPAWF works on so many fronts.
It's a shame, and isn't it a shame that in this day and age that that the federal minimum wage is $7.95 an hour, and we know that that wage cannot afford a living in most places across the U.S.
Yeah, it has been decades since that wage has been changed. If it were indexed to inflation, it would be in the 20s. I can pull up that exact stat, but if we were actually to look at what would be a livable wage, the minimum wage would be in the $20, $25 range. It would not be $7.25. Perhaps decades ago when that was created, that was enough to buy a meal. That was enough to pay rent if you were working 40 hours a week. We know that it is not now, that in most states, you would not be able to buy or pay for rent for a 1-bedroom or 2-bedroom apartment on that. So that is a really antiquated figure. And it allows people to depress wages across the states. Again, there are states that are doing the right thing and raising those wages, but the federal minimum wage allows people to pay as low as $7.25.
Yeah. So, Christina, on average, AANHPI women make 83 cents in comparison to non-Hispanic white men for full-time year-round workers. But this data does not reflect all groups. For communities like Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander women, the wage gaps are far greater. What are the main factors that you believe contribute to the severity of the wage gap for the lowest paid AANHPI women?
So I think there's a few things. One is our immigration system. Immigration status varies greatly within the AAPI community. People are not able to legalize their status. It is not as simple or as easy as I think most people believe. So again, that allows people to not only be paid minimum wage, but below minimum wage. It allows for an entire class of workers that have no worker protections, including wage, right? So that really does drop what people are offered. Access to education also. I mean, people are coming in and some of the jobs that they are able to get are in low wage industries. So that is part of that. We know that public education system really varies throughout the country, and that is part of what we're seeing. Like language and cultural barriers. So, people who are immigrated to this country. Again, Asia has a very diverse language base. There's several different languages. At NAPAWF, we're constantly talking in the advocacy tables that we're at about language justice and translation. And that is costly for government and for organizations to do. So often, if they don't have to do it, they won't do it. So people who are coming to this country from countries that speak languages that are not available here are not getting all the information on their rights or the opportunities that are offered to them. They may not know about workplace protections. They may not know about minimum wage. They may not know about what wage theft is or tipped wage, or they have no ability to advocate for themselves because this is not information they know. And they're coming to an entirely new country with a new system. So that is also something where if you're not aware of what your rights are because it is not in your language, you're not able to make those changes. And then I think there's an issue that does affect API women and girls, and it affects many communities is lack of affordable childcare. um, a lot of people have to make the decision between paying for childcare or working. And if you're making minimum wage, your minimum wage does not cover childcare, and childcare subsidies or affordable childcare is not often available to folks, either based on immigration status, based on what is allowed by local governments, based on what you're aware of, what you know about in your community. And it also allows for people who work in caregiving industries to have their wages depressed, right? They are trying to find work, they are offering to work for lower than what their time is worth. So all of these factors are really creating these issues for women and girls in the API community.
And then also, this country has historically uh, exploited labor. So Chinese immigrants came to the country and they worked on the transcontinental railroad, and their labor was exploited. Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, they were pushed into internment camps and forced into free labor. So this country has historically exploited labor.
Yeah, and arguably there are people who benefit from that. And so there is an investment in not changing these policies that would allow for our communities to thrive. But this is part of why NAPAWF has been doing this work for 30 years, and we're not looking at stopping anytime soon because there's a lot of work for us to do, and the work that we do and the advocacy that we do benefits our community and it benefits all communities of color.
Absolutely. So, in addressing the perpetual foreigner stereotype, how does NAPAWF use language access as a tool to assert the right of AANHPI women to full civic participation?
Language access is so core and will always be core to the work that we do and the work that all immigrant serving organizations do. I talked a little bit about it before. If you're coming into a new system in a new country and you don't speak the language, you don't know what's available to you. You don't know what your rights are. You don't know what the laws are. Even registering your child for school can be difficult. Learning how to vote so that you know how to choose the leaders, or you're able to choose the leaders that represent you and create the policies that affect your daily life. There's really no way to be fully participatory in your community if you don't understand what's happening around you and if the information is not given to you in language. There's also the piece of it where, language from a trusted community, information from a trusted community member in your language is something that you are, there is a lot of mistrust in information right now and disinformation. So getting it from a trusted source in language is also something that's really important. And so it is a core strategy and a core piece of the work that we do to fight for translation, to fight for language access policies and laws, to fight for, even within our own campaigns, to make sure that information is provided to our communities in language. We know that it is more time and more cost. We know that talking to people who don't speak English is something you have to plan for and to allocate more resources to in a campaign. But we also know that there's no change that is going to happen that helps our communities thrive without this.
Absolutely. So just for my audience to know what a perpetual foreigner is, it's typically you're perceived as the other, and your American citizenship is typically not recognized, even though your family have been here for generations. You know more about the term, so am I correct in stating that?
Yeah, and unfortunately, right now the Supreme Court is upholding this, right? Where the idea that ICE agents are now constitutionally allowed to approach someone that they believe not to be a citizen on site, right? So that obviously means someone who does not look, quote, American. And the perpetual foreigner, I mean, that is really rampant within that policy where it allows folks like my parents or other folks, that are naturalized citizens who have gone through the process or were able to go through the process to be targeted based on what they look like. So they will, it's a stereotype and sort of this myth that is now being encoded into policy.
Yeah. Considering that some AANHPI immigrant women are in low-wage jobs, what is the single most urgent piece of legislation NAPAWF is pushing to protect them from exploitation?
So again, the minimum wage laws and wage theft laws, I will say, that's the other piece of it, where there are employers who knowingly pay either below minimum wage. They will do something around tipped wages, there's a different minimum wage, but whether the worker actually gets their tips is a different piece of it, whether the worker is charged from those tips for damages to something. There's a lot of policies that are in place currently to protect workers, but that need to be strengthened. Again, if the wage floor was lifted for all industries in all states, it would really allow for less people to be working full time and still living in poverty.
Absolutely. So NAPAWF calls for data disaggregation to show the diversity within the AANHPI community. What is the most significant practical benefit society and major institutions could achieve for AANHPI women simply by collecting and using this granular data?
So, you can't fix what you can't see, right? If you don't know it's a problem, you don't know how to fix it. You don't even know it's a problem. And I think that is also why there are folks in the government right now who are trying to hide data, the data that already exists, trying to take information down from public websites and make, what is happening, all some of the issues that we face as a community happen in the dark, because then people will never know that is not that is something that needs to be invested in, changed, advocated for. We have always seen as an AAPI community that data on our specific, and even our community as a whole, is scarce. And it's a lot of the research that either we've had to do or partner with some of our research partners to create for ourselves. Things like access to healthcare, pregnancy outcomes, voting behaviors or civic engagement. All of those things are done on larger groups and often sort of skip over the API community, often because of the model minority myth, or people think it's too small of a community. A lot of this work is not funded. I recently read a stat that despite the growing population, only 0.2% of foundation funding goes to API organizations. And that's certainly not enough to address all the issues and the support that our community needs. So, I think that we see shining the light on these issues, the fact that there is wage disparity, the fact that there are economic, immigration, and racial justice needs and disparities within the API community. If people know that, and as a community, if we're aware of that, then we're able to organize and we're able to create change. But when these things happen in the dark, we're not able to push for change or convince people that it's worth investing in or even acknowledge that there's a problem.
And this is so critical because I read on your website that the AAPI community would be the largest ethnic group in the US by 2055?
Yeah, it's a very fast growing community. And, it's a community that he continues to contribute financially, socially, culturally, civically. But it's a community that is consistently underinvested in. And a big reason for that is because people don't know who we are, people don't know the issues that we face. And the research is not there to help back up what we're seeing in our communities. And that's why it's something that NAPAWF is really committed to not only conducting this research, but making it available to organizations and thought leaders and lawmakers across the country.
So moving on to my next question, the NAPAWF is a leader in multiracial coalition building with other women of color organizations. In the current political climate, what do you see as the greatest challenge and the most valuable strength of these shared efforts in advancing a collective agenda?
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to what I was saying, even from how the term model minority was coined, right? The forces that we are fighting against has for decades, for as long as we have known, have been working to divide us and to pit us against each other. If we're all fighting for scraps, then we're not really making a lot of progress. If we're fighting each other, we are not fighting the forces that are actually in power. And it's a strategy that has worked, and we're seeing more division within our country and our culture more than ever. Working in coalition, I mean, one, I will say that, I can say from working in the reproductive justice movement and working with our partners, the Latina Institute, the National Reproductive Latina Institute, and In Our Own Voices, which is a Black-led reproductive justice group, I have learned that a lot of the work that NAPAWF does is rooted and was founded by Black women. So the term reproductive justice, even NAPAWF is a reproductive justice group. We fight for more than access. We fight for more than laws, I should say. We fight for more than rights. We fight for access. So it is not enough to have laws saying that you are able to access reproductive health care. We need to look at the systems that create barriers for API women and girls to access those things. And that framework was created by Black women. The roots of gynecology, the roots of women's healthcare in this country were created by white male doctors who experimented on 3 Black women. And those 3 Black women involuntarily were experimented on, and everything that has come out about the science of gynecology is rooted in their oppression. So by working together, one, there is a long arc and there is power that we are building together. We understand that our histories are intertwined, and we are not allowing forces that are, lawmakers, government, whoever the forces are that are creating the issues and the oppression that we face to separate us and to have us fight each other. And it is a really powerful narrative for us to be working on. We have a campaign called Intersections, where we work specifically with the Latina Institute and In Our Own Voices. And this last April, we brought 300 women of color to the Hill to tell their stories about how lack of access to healthcare affects them, how it is a racial justice, economic justice issue. And having that diversity and 300 women from different communities tell the story of how they are all affected by these policies and lack of access is really powerful. And it allows people to not just say, this is something that one small community is facing, that is a broad-based issue. And, quite frankly, it also it shows people, if you want broad-based support, this is the community, these are the large numbers of people that are being affected.
And it's encouraging to hear you're showing how solidarity among women of color is not just strategic, it's transformative.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, just even beyond political advocacy, working across communities, especially in this time when we are um, facing a lot of hardships that we have not faced in past. We're always talking about living in unprecedented times, and I think we all know that it is hard as women of color to raise children in this community, in this environment, to go to work, to face workplace issues, and just having that solidarity right now. I can speak for myself even individually, is part of what keeps me doing this work, is what it keeps me feeling inspired and feeling that despite all the darkness, that there is joy in this work, and being able to hear um, I wouldn't say the similarities, but the common struggles between our communities, and knowing that we can work together and that our communities have been working together through history and will continue to do so, and being part of that work is really powerful. And that doesn't happen when you're working in silos or working alone. That happens through collaboration.
Yeah. In today's volatile political climate, how can NAPAWF ensure its momentum and influence persists, making sure the issues facing AA, NHPI women remain central to the national policy debate?
People ask this a lot, especially because right now the political landscape is so volatile and so difficult. And really, the answer is coming back to the roots of social change and advocacy and telling our stories, just letting people know what we're experiencing on an everyday, on an everyday basis, how there is a wage disparity, how people, there's that model minority myth, if we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and how, if you work hard enough, you'll be able to support your family. And we have countless stories from the ground to show that that is not true, that people are working full time and still in poverty, to show that, people's lack of access to healthcare, how that not only economically affects one family, but our entire country and our entire community, how lack of access to affordable childcare is a plague upon our whole country. And that is not just an individual experience, but the root of really changing hearts and minds of people and changing the story of how these issues are viewed by our country and by people around us is telling the stories, I mean, and sometimes one by one, of the people who are affected. And I always think back to, hopefully he doesn't listen to this, but I did have a cousin who was, we had very different political views, let's put it this way. And I would bring up an issue that I was working on. He's like, well, that doesn't affect anyone I know, so I don't have an opinion on that. And I think there's a lot of people that feel that way. And it's a very, there's an instinctual uh, there's human behavior that makes you care more about something when you know someone who's deeply affected. And by telling these stories, whether or not you know people individually, seeing clear examples of how the immigration system that is broken is not allowing families to thrive, how children are being affected by lack of SNAP, how people who work full time are on full food stamps. And it is not just people who are sitting with their hand out waiting for people to support them and help them. Telling the stories, or the stories of, how if a woman can't access an abortion, what happens to her? And that is not, how what leads up to those decisions, and then what happens afterwards, and how her health and the health of not just the child, but her, are affected by whether or not she's able to access a timely abortion. Those stories really add the human element to it. And I really think in these times where legislative and advocacy landscapes are difficult, we are going to continue the drumbeat of telling the stories from our community, and it will have a powerful effect.
I agree. And it's inspiring to hear how NAPAWF plans to sustain energy and influence in this challenging world today.
Someone recently said, we're not the first people to live through a hard time. And, we know that our ancestors and the people that have come before us have fought through a lot of difficulty. A lot of us who are here through immigrant families, our parents had to fight through a lot. And, we're not the first ones that have faced struggle. And so we know that this is not the time to back down. This is not the time to stop telling stories or to stop doing the work. We know that this is the time where we dig in and we keep fighting for our communities because they continue to need us no matter what the political climate is.
Thank you for your leadership. And that's all the questions I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this work and for shining light on these issues.
That's it for this episode of Conversations for Equal Pay. To tune into more episodes, log on to our website at conversationsforequalpay.org. You're listening to Conversations for Equal Pay.